Hello, everybody, and welcome to your vodcast on Charles Darwin and natural selection. Um, you might have heard evolution as being something defined as change. I'm going to do a little mathematical symbol here change over time. And to illustrate that, I've given a cute little picture that I found. Here's original Mario, like when I was young. This is what Mario looked like, very 2D. And now we have modern day Mario. So he has shadows and he's much, much better. It's much easier to tell what he is. Here we've got Link. I can hear the Zelda song in my head right now. Modern Link and old school Donkey Kong with modern Donkey Kong. So we can safely say that yes, these characters have evolved, they have changed over time. But when we're looking at evolution, and specifically Darwin's evolution, we're going to throw this out the window. And we're going to use the term descent with, here, let me write that where you can see that. So we're going to use the term descent with modification. So Darwin kind of coined this idea how species descend, we have descendants, right? And within that descension, there is change, there is modification to the physical appearance of those descendants. So before we look at Darwin, though, there is one guy worth mentioning, a Frenchman, and his name is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. You like my annoying wannabe French accent? So here's John Baptiste, after John the Baptist, and his last name was Lamarck. And he published this idea of evolution, this idea of new animals being evolved from older animals, right about the time Darwin was born. So this is 1809. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck got credit for his theory of how new species came about. And he had the general idea right, but the mechanism is what he had wrong. So his hypothesis became affirmed when, through the fossil record, they found old species leading to new species. And so he made the hypothesis that old species gave rise to new species. That's where all the species come from. They came from each other, kind of the whole tree of life idea. But the thing with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is that his mechanism of how he got there, let's erase this, was a little bit flawed. And let's talk about that for a second. So he had 2 points to how he thought evolution came about. The first was use and disuse. Now, that was the idea that, I'm going to put a little 1 there. That's the idea that organs and muscles, things we use a lot, get bigger and stronger, and things we don't use hardly at all become weaker and deteriorated. So he uses a giraffe as an example. So here we have an original short neck ancestor giraffe. Now, as that ancestor giraffe keeps stretching its neck to reach higher up the tree, it might stretch its neck throughout its lifetime. And he thought that if a parent giraffe were to stretch their neck and lengthen their neck and use those muscles, that that giraffe would then be able to pass that characteristic onto its offspring. So his second kind of idea, oops, that should be a 2. Second kind of idea is that acquired characteristics can be inherited. Okay, so he did think of this idea of animals being fit, right? As in, like, very neatly fit, not so much fit as in physical fitness, but fit to their environment. He did think of this whole idea, and he did mention that it was gradually changing over time. Yet we can kind of see the flaw in his idea. Acquired characteristics can be inherited. Well, I really wish that, my dad was a bodybuilder so I could be very, very buff, right? So there's that idea that the things that we do in life doesn't really change our genetic code, right? If I have blonde hair and I dye it brown, that doesn't mean my genes show that I have brown hair. So this is ultimately, oops, that's a cross out, what kind of makes Lamarck's whole argument about the mechanism of evolution flawed. So then, quite a while later, came Darwin, and this picture was taken of Darwin in 1840. This is right after he got back from his voyage on the HMS Beagle. And Charles Darwin came from a doctor family. His dad was a doctor, and he went to school to become a doctor, but he became very uninterested in it. He watched a surgery on a boy and had to leave the room because that was actually the time before anesthesia as well. So I would definitely be leaving the room. But he became really uninterested, but was still very science-minded. So he dropped out of med school, essentially, and joined the clergy, which is something that actually scientific-minded folk did back then in England. And then he kind of went back his roots to when he was a boy and became a naturalist, became very interested in the natural world and collecting bugs and trying to figure out all the complexities of the natural world. And then let's clear that. And then in 1831, Darwin went on this trip on the HMS Beagle. You guys know that. And he actually paid his own way and kind of just went as company to the ship captain. And that because they were kind of like the same class, and the crew, they were, lower class, if I should say that. And so he was kind of the company of the captain. And he, on the way, spent a lot of time on land collecting specimens and plants and observing geology. He then, which you guys probably know, ended up on these islands called the Galapagos Islands. They're volcanic islands just west of Ecuador on the equator. So there's Ecuador right there. The Galapagos is right there. And he was just astounded at the difference in species between the islands, and also how the species were incredibly different from the species he observed on the mainland. So he collected and collected. He was a very meticulous collector. He would label things. He would preserve things. He had an archive of so many living things, which you can now see at the Natural History Museum in London. And he was just super astonished by the special adaptations that he saw there. And we're going to watch a video in class that's going to show you some of these adaptations, but I'm sure you've heard of Darwin's finches and also the tortoises. So he was really curious if these specific adaptations that gave rise to new species were actually, unique creation events, or did these species come from other species? And that got him thinking about the mechanism. The mechanism of evolution, and he ultimately came with his theory of natural selection as his mechanism. So, over 20 years, no, nearly 20 years, a little less than 20 years, after he returned from the trip in 1859, he published The Origin of Species by means of natural selection. So, in nowhere in this title do you see the word, the definition of evolution. He's very just addressing where new species come from and the mechanism in which they come. So this was a big deal, and it was received by the scientific community fairly well, but there was also a lot of opposers that he struggled with. Just before he published it, this should be noticed, there was a man named Alfred Russel Wallace, but Wallace, you have to say Wallace in a British accent. And he essentially came up with the same hypothesis of natural selection, and he just had less collected evidence supporting the selection, so the scientific community published Darwin's book over his. So then Darwin, after The Origin of Species, went on to write many other books, trying to figure out kind of why the world is the way it is, and just on interesting things. So in 1871, he wrote The Descent of Man and Selection and Related to Sex, which we're going to talk about the difference between sexual selection. In biology, we talk about sex a lot, so you have to get used to it, and natural selection. So how do sexual pressures differ from natural pressures? And in, what year was that? 1872, he wrote this book called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And this includes a bunch of interesting sketches, and it's actually a pretty interesting book. So let's kind of take a look more at the mechanism of evolution and exactly how natural selection works. So I don't know if this wigs you out, but living on Earth right now, there are known 356 species of hummingbirds. When I was in Costa Rica, there was a hummingbird like the size of a crow, and it flew by my head, and it sounded like a helicopter. It was huge. But thinking about this, like, oh my goodness, there's 356 different species. A lot of them are specialized for a specific flower as well, which we'll get into. That's called coevolution. You know what's even crazier to think of is that scientists estimate that 99% of species, of all of the species ever alive, are extinct. So essentially, what we're seeing right now is only 1% of the species ever lived on the earth. Okay? Kind of crazy. So a big thing that Darwin studied was artificial selection. He actually started breeding pigeons and wanted to look at the whole idea of, okay, if humans can select traits and use the offspring of individuals with those specific traits, and generation after generation create a new organism, essentially, showing the selected trait. So here we have the original corn. It was just kind of this thing that looks like a grain of barley. So here's ancestral corn right here. And over generations of selection, so they would take a kernel on that was bigger and juicier, and they would plant that and create a plant out of it, and then out of that generation they would find the next biggest and the next biggest and the next biggest, essentially until we get our beautiful ear of corn right here. So this is our modern corn. And that's the same idea with dogs. It's kind of weird to think about that this little itty bitty Chihuahua and this giant Great Dane all came from the genetic information found within a wolf. So over time, humans selected for these special traits, and that's where we get all of these different dog breeds, essentially with the same genetic makeup, the same genetic materials that a wolf would, because that is their ancestor. So he kind of thought that, well, if humans can put pressure on organisms to change over time, why couldn't nature put pressure on organisms to change over time? And so there's this really awesome kind of poster child story of the peppered moth and the Industrial Revolution. So I'm going to put peppered moth. So Darwin, he did live in England, and England was the basically the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution was between 1750 and 1850. And before the Industrial Revolution, there was mainly these kind of lighter colored pepper moths. Now, peppered moths are in the family Lepidoptera, and they are eaten by birds. So, as you can imagine, if you're a bird, your eye is going to be drawn more to this. This guy's kind of like a big, blinky, eat me sign, right? Because he stands out like crazy against this light colored bark. And the light colored moth is hanging out, essentially camouflage. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, the allele frequency, now you remember with alleles, for every gene has two alleles, so we could just simplify it and say there's allele 1, there's allele 2, etc. So these would be your allele. This would be a dominant allele, and this right here would be a recessive allele, so that might be a little bit of review. And this would be heterozygous, because there's two different type of alleles, dominant and recessive. So back to what I was saying before, the allele frequency of the dark peppered moth was at 0.01% before the Industrial Revolution. So there weren't a lot of them, because if they were, they got picked off first and eaten. They got like a bum deck of cards, right? They're like, shoot, I hold a dark allele, and now I'm going to get eaten faster. Bummer. So then what happened is the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of soot got put on the trees from burning coal. And so then the dark moth is like, sweet, I don't stick out quite as much. So if you can see, here's the dark guy. And the light moth is super bummed because he is essentially wearing a big sign that says, eat me, okay? So generation after generation, birds continually sought out these lighter colored moths because they were easier to see. So less light moths could survive to produce offspring. So more dark colored moths were producing and making more offspring. So by 1895, which is at the end, well, past the Industrial Revolution, the allele frequency for the dark moth, so it was at 0.01%, the allele frequency for the dark moth was at 98%. Okay, this was natural selection and in living in broad daylight, right? So we have these light-colored trees where the dark ones stood out. The birds ate the dark ones, then the trees all of a sudden turned dark. The birds ate the light ones because they could see them better. And this is kind of a fancy word. Let me find my red. There we go. This fancy word is called industrial. Melanism. So this term melanism is referring to essentially genetic darkening. So the genetic makeup of a population is becoming darker. and industrial meaning it's caused by human industrial activities. So this whole thing is a natural selection, which gave rise to industrial melanism. These moths are, just so you know, kind of the poster child for natural selection. You'll probably be seeing them a lot. So after all of Darwin's observations and hanging out on all of his data for 19, 20 years, he made 4 main observations that, they're not that crazy. So here are his 4 observations. Here we go. Okay, the first one is that variation is innate. Okay, so there's variation everywhere. If we all held up our thumbs in class, we would all have different length thumbs. We all have different colored skin. We all have different distances between our eyebrows. We all have different distances between our toes. We have a ton of variation within our population if you just take the human population. Okay? Number 2 is inheritance. The idea that your traits and your genes are passed from parent to offspring, generation after generation after generation. Okay, so that's his second observation. Number 3 is overproduction. That's my dog scratching. So, overproduction is the idea that an organism can produce more offspring than it essentially needs to survive. Like, if I really wanted to, I could have a baby every single year for the next 10 years, all right? So then I would have 10 babies. That would definitely be overproduction, and I'm sure not all of them would survive, and it would just be a really horrible situation. So we have organisms overproduce, right? They make more babies so that the chance of the survival of their genes will carry on in the gene pool, okay? Number 4 is competition. Okay, through lack of resources and habitat, there's a struggle to survive. So we have a lot of offspring, and all of them are going to struggle to survive, right? It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. So with these 4 observations, Darwin made 2 inferences. And his first inference is that, okay, we've got a struggle to survive. Well, the ones that do survive have those favorable traits that make it more fit to their environment. So, favorable traits. I'm just going to do this little note here, and then you can write out the rest in your notes. Having a favorable trait essentially increases the possibility of you passing on those favorable traits. So the very fact that you can live longer and maybe you're more desirable increases the chance of you passing on those traits to the next generation. Okay? So, and then number 2 is essentially, you've heard this word before, survival of the fittest. Okay, and this is the idea that individuals survive and reproduce will lead to an accumulation of these favorable traits. Okay, so it's the favorable ones that survive, and they are essentially the most fit to their environment, so they're the ones that their traits are going to accumulate within a population. So that's essentially it. That's natural selection. And I just put in a few really cool things, because Darwin really looked at adaptation and how these crazy insects and mammals and birds were so specially adapted that were being fit. They were such a good fit to their environment. I was wondering how exactly that happened. So I was just going to leave you guys with these two cool pictures. These are mantids. I love mantids. They're amazing. Here we have a leaf mantid. I mean, how crazy is that? It looks exactly like a leaf. And here we have a orchid mantid. And that one's even kind of hard to pick out. So I will leave you with that. And that is our story on Darwin and natural selection.